He gave himself a strict talking to, and he said to himself, looking in the mirror in the toilet break, that he really had to get his stuff together. It's telling us something very important, which is we are all on an emotional journey. The interesting research evidence indicates that actually this kind of thing is helpful and does help athletes win and improve performance. But why is that? Jack Draper, a UK tennis star or ace, has just won the Indian Wells tennis tournament in the USA. This is one of the tennis tournaments that's regarded as one of the top 5 tennis tournaments, so it's a very important deal that he has won and broken through at this level. The final itself wasn't that interesting. He won it fairly easily. What's really interesting from a psychological standpoint is what happened in the semi-final. In the semi-final, he eventually triumphed over Carlos Alcaraz, who was by far and away, I would say, the more favoured player to win that. And the course of the match is very interesting psychologically, and I believe there are things that most of us, even if we're not interested in tennis, can learn to help us deal with problems and difficulties in our life. So what happened in the match, and it's important to remember that Jack Draper was playing a player who many would regard was much better than him. And Jack Draper won the first set fairly comfortably, much to the spectators' surprise, and I believe much to Jack Draper's own surprise. But then something very odd happened. Carlos Alcaraz regrouped, as tends to happen when you're playing players at that level, and went on to beat Jack Draper in the second set 6-0. Carlos Alcaraz won 6 games in a row. Clearly, the match was slipping from the fingers of Jack Draper. He then had a toilet break, and he went to this toilet break, and it is said afterwards in the press conference, what he said happened is he gave himself a strict talking to, and he said to himself, looking in the mirror in the toilet break, that he really had to get his stuff together. Anyway, he went back on court and then proceeded to win the final set, and therefore move on to the final and win the tournament overall. As a psychiatrist, I was very interested in this moment psychologically because it was a key turning point in the game. What on earth happened whereby he was able to turn the game around simply by giving himself a talking to? So I went and looked at the research literature at this to see whether actually this is a well-known phenomenon that can help people. It actually turns out it's a well-known technique used a lot in sports psychology, and it's got a technical term. It's called Self Instructional Training, or SIT. So self-instructional training is when you start speaking to yourself in the middle of a difficult situation and giving yourself exhortations or instructions. Now, there are different kinds of self-instructional training or self-talk, and the research into this is very interesting in terms of why it might be helpful, or whether it's helpful at all, really. But one of the first key points I want to discuss is the fact that self-instructional training or talking to yourself or giving yourself a good talking to is very popular as a technique in sports psychology. Why is it popular in sports psychology, yet relatively unknown in the rest of psychiatry and psychology? That's because in sports psychology, what's happening is players are in a high-stakes situation in real time and have to do something about deteriorating performance very rapidly or almost immediately. And it is interesting to see from the research that self-instructional training or giving yourself a self-talk does seem to be helpful. There are 2 kinds of self-instructional training or self-talk. One is motivational, saying to yourself out aloud or inside your head, saying to yourself things like, come on, you're good enough, you can beat this person, things that improve motivation. But there's another kind, self-instructional training, which is called more instructional. And what that means is you say something to yourself like in the middle of a tennis game, follow through more with the backhand, or hit the ball deeper. In other words, you give yourself specific instructions about how to accomplish a task in a more technical way. You're more technically goal-directed. The interesting research evidence indicates that actually this kind of thing is helpful and does help athletes win and improve performance. But why is that? Well, one very obvious and basic theory is that actually if you observe athletes in action and something begins to go wrong, they can often get very frustrated and upset with themselves. And that emotional upset can lead to deterioration in performance. One famous player, Andy Murray, is famous for having what many people would call a kind of meltdown on the court, where he starts shouting at himself and at his team. Some people would say that this kind of venting helps Andy Murray retain a certain kind of emotional stability. Other sports psychologists would say it's not that helpful and maybe adds to his emotional disturbance. But the very fact that he's doing it, and as a player who's reached a very high level in the game, means that it must have been discussed with his team and they haven't told him not to do it. He must be finding it helpful at some level. So one theory as to why it works is maybe it stops negative self-talk. Maybe in giving yourself positive self-affirmations, it simply stops being negative, and that in itself is why it works. When you care a lot about performance and you notice that you're making errors on court or in any kind of situation which is high stakes and you care a lot about your performance, you can go negative on yourself. You can start to berate yourself and become broody and preoccupied with your negative performance. And maybe that negativity leads to a cycle of a rapid deterioration in performance. Maybe all that positive self-talk does is it stops you going negative. Interestingly enough, research indicates that negative self-talk for some players can be quite motivating, actually. It depends on your personality. And I do wonder in the case of Andy Murray, whether actually his, what many people would say is negative self-talk, he just berate himself on the court, actually at some level is motivational. So one of the things I would say is self-talk works, and the kind of self-talk depending on your personality. You may have to tailor the self-talk to suit your personality. Another interesting point about the research is which works better? The coach gives you things to say to yourself, or you work out things that are better for you to say to yourself. No one knows the answer to that question, but I think you could try both things out. You could write down a list of things that you might want to say to yourself that are positive affirmations in terms of motivation or instructions in terms of technical detail of performance, and give yourself those statements on a list you've written down at times of difficulty, or you might want to make some stuff up for yourself in the moment. But the evidence is that some kind of self-instructional training does appear to be helpful. There are two famous tennis players that were engaged in a titanic battle between each other many years ago, Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe. And what's very interesting about this is they had a very different approach, both of them, to self-instructional training on the court. John McEnroe famously was incredibly expressive, and there's even a famous phrase that he coined called "you cannot be serious" when he would berate tennis officials on the tennis court. Bjorn Borg, in contrast, was very, very silent and developed the nickname of Iceborg or Iceman on the tennis court. What is interesting is they actually both were incredibly successful. So we can't say that self-talk was good for one person and bad for the other. What we can say is they developed a way of being on a tennis court that worked for them personality-wise. What self-instructional training and the power of it is telling us something very important, which is we are all on an emotional journey. And in high-stakes situations, it could be at work or on a date, your emotions can come into play. If you care a lot about the outcome, you can become anxious and you can become negative. Self-instructional training is a way of regaining poise, regaining self-control, and there is some evidence that actually it is very helpful in terms of self-control. One key point I want to make is that on a tennis court, in a game, we often are upset with ourselves because we're trying to hit the ball well over the net, we're trying to do better in life, and we get frustrated that we can't seem to control ourselves. We can't seem to control the outcome. Despite our best efforts, the ball still goes in the net or goes out of the court. So one of the things that's very important to understand is sometimes we can feel like spectators to our own behavior, and that can be very frustrating. We need to be aware of what we can control and what we can't control, and we need to become a little bit calmer in the face of that. Staying calm, controlling what you can control, which is actually talking to yourself, is some level of control. Maybe that's why it works. Another final point I want to make about why it works is when we were children, our parents encouraged us. They said, come on, you can do it. or they gave us instructions about how to focus, and we found that conversation or instructions from our parents helpful. Is it possible that as adults, we are kind of remembering that at some level, and in giving ourselves instructions, we are hooking back to that moment in our lives earlier on when parental authority figures or authority figures of some kind gave us instructions during live performance, and we found that helpful and reassuring. We're kind of like being parents to ourselves. So finally, Jack Draper turned around a match where he was losing and seemed to be losing pretty badly, turned it around and achieved eventual victory. I believe you can turn your life around, and of the many techniques you can use, you should consider thinking about self-talk, self-instructional therapy, and maybe just the fact that Jack Draper gave himself a break, took himself away from the stress and the emotional turmoil of that tennis match, and had a quiet time to himself, some contemplative time where he could speak to himself. That in itself was important. Having spent a lot of time emphasizing what I think could be really interesting and important about self-instructional training, or self-instructional therapy, it's sometimes referred to, or the fact that Jack Draper had a word with himself, I really think it's quite important to make another point here. While we are focusing on that thing, and that may have made a difference, and maybe helped Jack Draper beat Alcaraz in the end, and maybe Alcaraz needs to learn something about his emotional management from my observations of his behavior on the tennis court, despite the fact he's an extremely talented tennis player. One key point I want to make is there's a sense in which victory in tennis matches is determined long before either player arrives on the court, or maybe to some extent what happens on the court. A lot of training has gone on in the background, and I believe that training can be physical and mental. I believe that maybe both players have been engaged in mental training to learn to control themselves. And while what happens live in the moment is important, and may have been very important in this particular match, let's not get away from the fact that the training bit, the hours and hours of training both professionals put in, is actually what took them eventually to that very high level of tennis playing ability and Jack Draper to eventual victory. The reason I want to emphasize that is what tends to happen is people just see performance, they don't see all the hours of training. Therefore, they tend to not place enough emphasis on that. It's that bit that actually also is hugely important in terms of ultimate victory. And it's the training and the training and the training that often will lead to calmness on the court. So playing in tournament after tournament after tournament in front of hundreds of thousands of people is actually, in the end, that grind over a long period of time is one of the key things that delivers victory. The reason I'm emphasizing that point with you now is I believe that many people getting involved in sports psychology are looking for a magic bullet. They're looking for a quick technique that will deliver victory without understanding, yes, I think self-instructional training was crucial to why Jack Draper eventually won, but let's not forget the many hours and hours of training that went into it, and let's not forget that you need hours and hours of training to be victorious in various predicaments in your life, and you can't just do it with a magic bullet. The magic bullet search is usually something that is not helpful in the long run.